The topic of this presentation is food insecurity and homelessness in rural Canada. I'll be walking you through these themes as presented in the papers by Tracy Galloway, Kristen Lowitt, and Joan Brown with assistance from Goss, Gilroy Incorporated. Perhaps you've always known safety and security, have had access to the daily comforts that we sometimes take for granted, like a hot shower, a cozy bed for sleeping in, and a kitchen filled with nutritious foods that you enjoy eating. Perhaps this has not always been the case, and at some point in your life, or maybe even at this time, you've lived without a secure, predictable roof over your head or without the knowledge of where your next meal will come from. For thousands of Canadians, both situations are a chronic reality. For rural Canadians in particular, food insecurity can be exaggerated and homelessness hidden in comparison to urban counterparts. Food security and insecurity are described in several ways. For statistical purposes, it may be determined that food insecurity exists in a household when one or more members don't have access to food that they need because of a lack of money. To say that an individual or a community is food secure may be describing a situation where residents can obtain safe, culturally acceptable, and nutritionally adequate foods. Food is a part of our personal identities, as spiritually nourishing as it is physically nourishing. Food is social, religious, moral, immoral, personal, familial, and traditional. Access to appropriate food depends on where you live in the country, if you're a member of a particular ethnic group, what language you speak, how much money you make. For example, people living in the northernmost parts of Canada can tell you that they face the highest food prices in the country. A commentary by Tracy Galloway indicates that efforts to improve the situation have had mixed results. A food subsidy program called Nutrition North was implemented in 2011 in an attempt to improve upon the previously used food mail program. The subsidy goes directly to retailers who ship large volumes of groceries to the north. The idea is that by subsidizing certain eligible food items, the cost to consumers would be reduced since retailers wouldn't need to charge as much to recover their costs. It turns out that the newer program hasn't been monitored in such a way that the major goals of the program, to improve access and affordability, could be properly evaluated. Groceries and supplies are subsidized differently depending on where exactly in the north they're being shipped. The process for calculating the subsidy isn't transparent, so it isn't even known if funds are being distributed equitably. All in all, this program has not produced the intended results, and a comprehensive and independent assessment is desperately needed. The cost of food is certainly an important factor that contributes to a food-secure home, but remember as well that food and food security is also connected to accessing culturally, traditionally appropriate foods. Changes to the economic and political climate can have drastic effects on traditional careers and skills, which can trickle down into changes or even the loss of food preparation knowledge and skills, or even food preferences. For example, a recent study published by Kristen Lowitt examined the social and ecological interactions that occurred in the Bombay region on the west coast of Newfoundland over the course of the last century. In that time, the area saw swings in the population due to changes in job opportunities in the fishing and forestry industry. Once upon a time, the population was more migratory, moving to different parts of the province for better catches of fish, and residents practiced more subsistence farming to be self-sustaining and to avoid a credit situation with local merchants. Even today, one of the main industries in Bombay area is fishing. Much like the rest of rural Canada, Bombay has also seen a lot of outmigration of those seeking more reliable employment. Despite the changes to the fishery in Bombay and elsewhere, the author of this study interviewed local residents who revealed that the fishery remains important to food security as it still contributes to local livelihoods, local diets, and culture. The particular way in which the fishery has impacted food security has changed over the last century. For example, even though crab is commercially fished nowadays, one fisherman remarked that crab was something his father, also a fisherman, used to throw back because nobody knew how to cook it. These days, the average person in Bombay knows how to cook the ever-popular codfish, but this skill too is changing with the passing of time. Younger generations in this study said they don't know what to do with cod, meaning they don't know how to prepare the fish for a meal. This is related to changes in family structures, long commutes to work, which cut into food preparation time, and the availability of convenience foods, which removes the need for many traditional food skills. Another point made by the study participants and the author is that fish and other seafood in Newfoundland is treated as a commodity and not as a food. Historically, fishing was so ingrained into the culture that songs and festivals were created in remembrance and celebration of that resource. Now, residents of the Bombay area, and really all Newfoundlanders and Labradorians are restricted to what they can and can't catch for their own consumption. Lobster and crab, for example, are only to be fished by commercial harvesters, and outside of the food fishery time, it's challenging for Newfoundlanders to acquire local seafood products without the appropriate buyer's license. These are barriers to accessing seafood that were created by policymakers interested in food as a commodity, and these rules didn't always exist. Ultimately, the author of the study aimed to make the point clear that food security over the long term depends on the capacity of a community like Bombay to make decisions about food policy and practice. Returning to another important issue facing rural Canada is homelessness. Homelessness can be described as the situation of an individual or family without stable, permanent, or appropriate housing, or being without the immediate prospect, means, and ability of acquiring it. It doesn't always mean living on the street, but it does include a range of situations such as accessing emergency shelter, living in substandard conditions, or being at risk of losing a residence because of changes to income. Most people don't choose to be homeless, and being homeless affects lives in ways that are often taken for granted by those who have always had safe and secure housing. Without a stable home or address, a person is unable to file for income support, which can then affect other purchasing abilities. A person can't even acquire a provincial health card without an address, making it nearly impossible for a homeless person to cover basic healthcare needs. An address is needed for a driver's license or other government photo ID, which is needed not just for driving, but for getting security clearance for new employment, among other challenges. It may be surprising to hear, but homelessness is as much of a problem for people living in rural areas as for those living in urban areas. One of the major differences is that homelessness is more hidden in rural areas. People without stable housing tend to live in their cars or campers or with friends or relatives in very cramped quarters. Rural areas tend to be missing shelters or other outreach programming and services that are typically found in urban areas. A defining aspect of rural homelessness is that a person's problems and issues are on display for everyone and open for judgment, and often, even when a person has gotten back on their feet, the fact that they've ever had to ask for help clings to their reputation. These features aren't as common in the anonymity of a large urban center. It's challenging to rally support for addressing rural homelessness because historically interested or affected parties have had no real way to congregate and advocate for changes to services. In 2012, a report was prepared called Taking Care of Our Own for the Newfoundland and Labrador Housing and Homelessness Network. The report outlined a service delivery model for meeting the needs of people at risk of or experiencing homelessness in rural Newfoundland. The information for the report came from a variety of community-based and government service providers from across Newfoundland and Labrador. They looked at the availability of affordable housing in the province and asked the perspectives of people living in rural Newfoundland. Some of the models used across Canada and within urban centres of Newfoundland included housing first strategies, supportive housing strategies, and shelter and support services. Housing first strategies focus on finding permanent secure housing for individuals and families before any other issues are addressed. Individuals don't need to prove they're worthy of housing by following strictly set, externally imposed norms, but instead participants must follow basic lease agreements, and they're simultaneously provided with important services and supports. The appeal of the Housing First model is based on the premise that in order to address one's life's challenges, no matter how big or small they might be, individuals must have a safe home base from which to start. Another example is supportive housing model, which might provide services for youth who are aging out of the child protection system. Supportive housing not only provides emergency shelter but connects youth with community youth workers who help to teach new skills and support youth in overcoming barriers to maintaining stable housing. A third example is a package deal of shelter services paired with health and educational supports. When individuals access temporary shelter, they are provided with meals and transportation as well as counseling for employment or crisis situations, and there's no limit on how long people can stay. The report encouraged the Newfoundland Housing and Homelessness Network to consider the most effective way to proceed. In order to be successful, a framework would need to be created and decisions made about whether or not to become a registered charity or how to become incorporated. Moving forward, the report outlined considerations for governance such as choosing a leadership team and creating vision statements and mandates and so on. The solutions to homelessness are both simple and complex, and it will take a great leadership to implement the strategies that are known to work. The report concluded with an apt remark. that the solutions to homelessness in the province will be identified and implemented by those who recognize that homelessness is not aligned with the historic belief in the value of our people and in their inherent ability to contribute to the well-being of their communities.